First, I want to take a question because I like to take the questions since we do the live show and you guys are in the chat. And then I'll get into discussion around Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Trejan Bridges and Tylan Wallace, which I think is really good because shout out Lincoln Riley for keeping it 100. Let me see. Looking for a member in the chat. Hey, RJ, have you heard the holdup with Gundy putting in anyone other than Sanders? So there's something to unpack there. Mike Gundy is a believer in guys that have paid into his program. He wants to see veterans and upperclassmen have the most opportunity to play football at Oklahoma State. He believes that that is how you build a culture at a place like Oklahoma State. If you know that you get to play right away, then perhaps you're not as bought in as kids that have played or been in your program for 3 years, 4 years. Now, if you're the best player, that's one thing. But even when we thought Spencer Sanders was the best player, he was not necessarily getting the looks, right? So much so that even Drew Brown, who grad transferred and redshirts from Hawaii, has to sit behind Spencer Sanders when all of us are like, yo, man, didn't this dude throw for like all the yards at Hawaii? What's he doing back there? Turns out Drew Brown wasn't really that good to begin with. But Spencer Sanders has been turning the ball over. I think that Shane Illingworth has an opportunity to be a better quarterback than Spencer Sanders, which is saying a lot because coming out of Denton, that was one of the most highly regarded quarterbacks in a Mr. Texas football coming out, right? We all wanted to see him, and we all thought that the Spencer Bowl that will be this weekend was going to be an all-timer, and yet he has not been able to stop putting the ball on the ground and throwing it to the other team. When we saw Shane Illingworth against Tulsa and a little bit in the following game, I was like, that's the dude. The true freshman quarterback, that's the guy. That's the best quarterback you got on the roster. Mike Gundy wants to play the guy that's paid into his program, the guy that he believes has bought into what they're doing in Stillwater. I believe in playing the best players, right? I recruited dudes to play better than the guys that I last recruited. That is the point, right? We want to get better and better and better. And if that means that I got to start Trevor Lawrence over Kelly Bryant, that's what I'm going to do. That's where I live. That's what I believe, right? But people were saying the same thing about Jalen Hurts and Spencer Rattler last year. It was, yo, this kid Hurts won't throw the ball down the field. He holds the ball for too long, and he puts the ball on the ground. Why don't we see the true freshman? To which we're kind of getting to see why that is, right? Rattler's more of a gunslinger right now. He's still going to let it fly. But there are some situations in which you want to see him either get rid of the football or try to take off and go get what he can. Jalen Hurts was also a much more seasoned leader and a seasoned quarterback, having won a national championship and been an SEC Offensive Player of the Year, along with being the kind of dynamic threat that he was as a runner. Matter of fact, going into Bedlam last year, Jalen Hurts had Mike Gundy out there saying that Oklahoma was running the wishbone out of the spread, which is just the spread, Mike. Like, that's all that is. The spread is the wishbone. Like, that's what it is, just triple option. And yet he's like, they run triple option. Actually, no, they don't. It's just Jalen Hurts has the opportunity to run with the ball in situations where he could just as easily hand it off or throw it. And he just decides to throw it or run it or hand it off. It's not a triple option. And he got torched. Like, we had Kennedy Brooks rushing for 160 yards. We had Jalen Hurts throwing for like 163. In a game where Chuba Hubbard was not bad. I think it's like 24 rushes for 104 yards. So I think the holdup, to answer your question, is that Mike Gundy does not want to set a precedent by playing the true freshman ahead of the redshirt sophomore that he thinks is paid into his program. So what I wanted to discuss as in regard to Bedlam is something that Lincoln Riley had to say, and what I wrote about on OUinsider.com, and I want to reference this quote because it was a good one in a candid interview but media availability that Riley gave, which is to say that Trejan Bridges' game, sophomore wide receiver at Oklahoma, nobody's seen play, is not unlike that of Tylan Wallace, who last year I thought was the best wide receiver in the country before he blew out his ACL. He led Oklahoma State in receiving in every one of those games, was having the kind of season that Chuba Hubbard was having, right? He was the lead dog of that three-headed monster before Chuba had his breakout season. So the quote that he gave was, as far as skill set, the guy that we most like, or that's most like him for us, he and Trejan Bridges, their games are very, very, very similar, remarkably similar in my opinion. But yeah, our guys get to go up against good receivers, but Tylan's tremendous, and he just does some things very, very well that are difficult to defend. Now, he answered that question in response to, with the kind of talent that you have at wide receiver, who do you trust to give you a good look of who Tylan Wallace might be when you play against him on Saturday? And then he popped up with Trejan Bridges, right? Nobody actually fed that to him and was asking, is Trejan Bridges like Tylan Wallace? And asked him to answer that question, though I think that would have been a decent enough question. Lincoln Riley just popped up with that. And that also, one, reminds us how good Trejan Bridges could be, right? Because last year, that dude played on all three teams, right? Special teams, offense, and he played some safety. Didn't look that great playing safety, but he played some safety, and they trusted him to do it. Like, that's what you had in Trejan Bridges. It also adds to what I think the core of that pass-catching unit actually could be, which is an all-timer, right? Trejan Bridges might be the third best wide receiver of those four that they brought in 2019 of that sophomore core that basically leads the receiving unit that includes Jaden Hazelwood, Theo Weiss, Austin Stogner, and of course, Bridges. And you can make a great argument that Stogner or Weiss or even Hazelwood might be better wide receivers than Trejan Bridges, but also to that, it's another piece, another chess piece on the board that Riley has not been allowed to play with. And there is a contingent of Oklahoma fan that believes if Riley had been allowed to play Ronnie Perkins, Ramondre Stevenson, and Trejan Bridges to start the season, Oklahoma would be undefeated. And they'll even go as far as to say Ramondre Stevenson and Ronnie Perkins alone make Oklahoma an undefeated football team through this period with the way that they played the last couple of games since Ronnie Perkins and Ramondre Stevenson have been back. Because while a lot of people are going to pay attention to the back-to-back 62 points that they put up against Texas Tech and Kansas, what I paid attention to is how sure the defensive line has become, along with the secondary, because Oklahoma's real lapses on defense and the way in which they got beat by Iowa State and Kansas State is their secondary blew some coverages and got hit big. Like Deuce Vaughn is still running, right, for Kansas State through the middle of that defense. And you can throw any one of those three tight ends that Iowa State had against Pat Fields, and he was keeping it 100. They're so big. It's difficult, right? You need to be able to either get home quicker with your pass rush or shore up your coverages. And I think some of that is obviously shoring up your coverages. Having Trey Norwood play some strong safety and some nickel helps you tremendously if you're Oklahoma. You also get a Justin Harrington back who played a few snaps there against Texas Tech for sure. But also, on the other side, when you haven't had Jaden Hazelwood for most of the season, right, he just gets back. That's probably your most talented wide receiver, and I'm including Marvin Mims in that calculation, right? You also are just getting dudes that are comfortable with playing in the offense, like Obi Obialo, right? You're using your H-backs, your tight ends, in a myriad of ways. Along with Stogner, you're getting Mikey Henderson in there, Jeremiah Hall when you can have him, Braden Willis when he had been available to start, right? You're breaking in new tailbacks. Seth McGowan is a true freshman. Marcus Major is not used to that kind of workload, and TJ Pledger's finally coming into his own. It's before you get Ramondre Stevenson back, who was already your best tailback on paper. And then you're starting to gel as an offensive line, and your quarterback's getting a little bit more comfortable. I think adding Trejan Bridges to that mix definitely makes Oklahoma a favorite to win the Big 12 championship going into this week, because all they do is win out, they win the Big 12 championship, right? They just got to win Oklahoma State, West Virginia, Baylor, and then you play in a Big 12 championship game, and you're looking at a New Year's Six bowl, probably the Cotton Bowl, maybe against Texas A&M, depending on what happens, Florida, Alabama, and an SEC championship game. But Riley just going out of his way to say Trejan Bridges and Tylan Wallace's games are a lot alike also speaks to, I think, the wide receiver talent in Texas, right? And I know that Texas fans going to roll their eyes about this because they know what kind of talent they got in the state of Texas. But Tylan Wallace was there for you, and he was ranked, I think, just behind Sam Ehlinger in the 247 Sports Composite, overall rankings in the state of Texas at the time. CeeDee Lamb also comes out of Texas. Marvin Mims, Lone Star Frisco, comes out of Texas. Charleston Rambo comes out of Texas. We can keep going, right? Theo Weiss coming out of Allen, right? Where Kyler Murray, EJ Ndoma Ogar, and Lee Morris and others have come out of to play a little football at Oklahoma. Bobby Evans being another one of those. I mean, Tay Evans. Like, you keep going, right? They know what kind of talent they got there. But that Dennis Simmons has been able to develop that talent. That's the other reason I think the Trejan Bridges comp is important. Casey Dunn was the wide receiver coach that identified Tylan Wallace and developed Tylan Wallace into what I thought was going to be a Biletnikoff Award finalist at the very least had he stayed healthy last year. Matter of fact, I think like 10 games into the season, he was still one of the top 5 pass catchers in receiving yards over the course of the season, having only played 8 games. Add to that what Dennis Simmons has been able to do with all sorts of wide receivers, whether it be D.D. Westbrook coming from junior college or Sterling Shepard, who was born and bred and raised to be a Sooner, right? Son of the late Derek Shepard, or CeeDee Lamb, who came with all sorts of talent and then blossomed into that guy after Hollywood Brown was taken, another JUCO dude that Dennis Simmons turned into a first-round draft pick. Given some time, I think that you could be looking at a really, really great group of receivers and probably the most talented group of receivers in college football if Trejan Bridges is healthy and ready to play and released to play. Now, in as far as his suspension, I don't know what the holdup is. I mean, and Riley's been more than a little perturbed about the questions about the holdup for any of those kids' suspensions. Like, it's one of the questions that he just loathed answering, so much so that even like going into the game against Texas Tech, he's like, I got nothing to say. I don't know. I'll let you guys when I know. They find out that they can get those guys eligible to play the Friday before the Saturday, and they go play and they have themselves games. But I this whole season has been just toss it out. Like, the number of people that are actually watching college football, like watching sports in general, but watching college football is way down. This has been a really terrible November in as far as a month in which most people are really tuned into college football. We lost Texas and Kansas earlier today to postpone rescheduling for December 12th, right? Oklahoma has been lucky in that it hasn't had any of its games rescheduled or canceled due to COVID-19, either on their own part or on the part of their opponents. I'm hesitant to say that we're going to get through the rest of this week without Oklahoma State having to do something, because Stillwater ain't exactly been a bastion of COVID-19 restrictions and safety protocols, all right? Like, they were having COVID parties and they had sorority houses that had to be locked up to start the season. We'll have to wait and see. I hope it gets played, like I hope all these games get played. But I also hope that we get to see Trejan Bridges, because that comp to Tylan Wallace is only going to serve to whet your appetite a little bit more. All right, let's take a look at the chat here. Let's see.